Boardroom Bound, episode 126, translating the skill set from the battlefield to the boardroom with Dick Newton. Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with Dick Newton. This is a special episode I have a few times a year where I get to spend the holidays of Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Veterans Day talking with some of our senior military leadership and how they use that experience and translate across the boardroom. Well, Dick fits that category. 34 years in the military, culminated in the Air Force Assistant Vice Chief of Staff. That's the number 3 person in charge of the Air Force. Remember, the Air Force is a multi-billion, tens of billions of dollars organization with hundreds of thousands of employees. Pretty big position, easily translates across to C-suite at some of the biggest companies in the world. And he has then translated that career over into the next step where he sits on several boards now, some of which are public, and he's going to share some of the insights that he had today and help us understand what that looks and feels like for any of us who want to make a transition and land in the boardroom. So let's jump into the show. Dick Newton, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Alexander, it's great to be with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to join in with you. And frankly, I consider it, again, a highlight for me and an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, that is kind because this is literally my honor, right? I want to have several episodes a year where I am honoring our service members. And when I think about this Memorial Day episode, I could not be more pleased to have you of already a fast friend of mine and someone I'm excited to share your story with. And this will be applicable to everybody in our audience because everyone is always thinking about, so who am I? What am I known for in my industry, in my space? And as I think, how do I land those board seats or land more of those board seats? I have to have that position of authority. I have to have something that stands out. So while this episode will highlight the amazing qualities and experiences of some of our service members, it's also a wonderful story about how someone takes what they've done and did really well, because you rose to the upper echelons of the military, and we'll explain what that looks and feels like, and then translate that successfully into the boardroom space. But I know most of our members, even if they have a history like I do of my family of so many members serving, we'd probably get lost in the TLAs, the 3-letter acronyms, and not really fully understand what that looks and feels like. So Dick, you've had an illustrious career in your first career, I'll call it, in the military. Can you sort of set that up, some background and experience, and explain that to us?
I'm delighted to, but just first off, if I may, set the table for Memorial Day. It's a very, very special day in the Newton household, having served. Actually, I was an Air Force child, born on an Air Force base at Forbes Air Force Base in Kansas, and all the way, the long continued line of service continues with our daughter and son-in-law, who's an Air Force Special Operations pilot and doing extraordinary things. But Memorial Day, for our audience, and frankly for the entire nation, is a very special day. It's a solemn day. It's a day that we honor those who were killed in line of duty, serving in our military, as well as we, and for Jody and I, my wife of now 42 years, again, just by my side and a tremendous woman in her own right. But we think of not only those who were killed in action or killed in the line of duty, but also their family members who are left behind, those Gold Star family members who are without their loved ones on Memorial Day. And so I just throw that in there. It's a very, very special day, a solemn day, and a very important day for America, in my view.
And I'm going to pick up on one thing there. It's not just about the person who served, but their family, because they all sacrificed as well. Because
absolutely,
let's just put this in context. You moved quite a few times, right, Dick? You have a rough number there?
We did. Like I said, I was born at Forbes Air Force Base. My father was West Point graduate, and in the class of 50 at West Point, and then went on to fly combat over North Korea and so forth, and then My sister came along, then I came along in the mid 50s or so, and I went to 13 schools in 12 years as an Air Force kid, and finally ended up being selected to go to the Air Force Academy. I wanted to be like Dad. I wanted to follow Dad in his footsteps. He was a commander in the Air Force and an illustrious, bomber pilot and so forth. And so I chose, and thankfully was given the privilege to go to the Air Force Academy. Spent 4 years there. The longest I'd ever been anywhere in my life up to that point was 4 years at the Air Force Academy, believe it or not.
Wow.
3 days before I graduated, I met my wife, Jody. She was my blind date for graduation festivities, as well as she was a bridesmaid, and I was a groomsman in my roommate's wedding, and she was a bridesmaid. And so, 3 months later, we're engaged, and 10 months later, we find ourselves starting our Air Force family life together, married, and again, 25 moves later, we find ourselves here on Jupiter Beach in South Florida. But she is just awesome and beautiful in so many ways. But we started out in Del Rio, Texas. I went to pilot training there, and then got selected to be an instructor pilot in the T-38. They call it the White Rocket, and just had a great start to our it was a honeymoon that lasted 3.5 years there in Del Rio, Texas, of all places, out on the border. But fast forward through a number of moves and other command opportunities. I got to command the first Stealth B-2 Squadron. I was a B-1 Operations Group Commander, a B-52 Wing Commander, and then was blessed to be selected to be a Brigadier General, and then moved up the ranks, serving on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, got to serve in a combatant command at the higher echelons of the military leadership, and then selected nominated and then confirmed by the Senate to serve as a Lieutenant General, which is a 3-star general. I had 2 tours of duty in the Pentagon, and culminating as essentially the number 3 position on the Air Staff, overseeing the entire 670,000 person United States Air Force as the Assistant Vice Chief of Staff. And Jody and I ended our career almost as fast as we started it. We were in a key position, which included her service as well in terms of hosting and accompanying me, up to Capitol Hill to testify, or actually also, if you think about Memorial Day, accompanied me very solemnly as remains came home, those killed in action, as a dignified transfer up at Dover Air Force Base. We would welcome, again, with much solemn approach with those who were returned to their family members as they were coming home, and then also by my side during a number of occasions at Arlington, where for burials for our killed in action and so forth. Anyway, that encapsulates it, and then here we are in the private sector 10 years later after we transitioned from the Air Force, and back in 2012 or so. And so that's as quick as I can do it without doing it justice of all the details in between. But hope that sets up a good discussion, Alexander.
It does, and let me just give a little context. So we can probably imagine, say, the Joint Chiefs of Staff at a meeting with the President. We see that on the press and all the medals. You want to look at their shoulders, right? You see the number of stars they have. It maxes out at a 4. And there are very few 4s, and there's certainly not that many 3 either. So you're probably talking what a few hundred, Dick, right? So this is a very small, probably living and serving, right? Retired and serving. So that's a small cohort of people. We need to think of them as C-level executives. That would be the easiest way to think about it, because the Air Force is a multi-billion-dollar business with hundreds of thousands of employees.
That's correct, and it really, it really sets one up for a variety of opportunities as you transition, especially the retiring general officers and flag officers. Flag officers refer to those who've served in what would be general officer positions in both the United States Navy and the Coast Guard. But for general officers, it is a very, very small food group, if you will. And as you transition into your private life now, into commercial life, perhaps after government service, there are a lot of opportunities. A lot of folks decide to go work for defense industry. Some go into academia. Some, look for opportunities maybe, in fields that they've always been interested in. Could be supply chain management and so forth, or some C-suite positions in small to medium to large companies. Jody and I took the path less traveled. I helped run a nonprofit called the Air Force Association first, and then we transitioned up to New York City and became acquainted with a lot of business opportunities up there, and finally came back home to Florida. Mom had passed away, and Dad was starting to gray out a little bit and so forth. But we felt compelled to come back home and look into opportunities in the private sector, and plus we're grateful that we were able to end up here again in South Florida. But board opportunities came our way, and that's where we took opportunity to maybe go a little bit different path in the financial venture capital investment world.
So, Dick, I'd love to dig into that, but let's talk about translating the skill set across, let's say from battlefield to the boardroom, right? Because just like anyone else who's trying to translate, like I was an executive, I got successful by doing, and now I want to move into the boardroom space. But there's always this conundrum of how do you get sort of the chicken egg scenario? How do you get the job that experience without the job? And we talk on this show that you need to show people that you've been in the boardroom, whether you've presented to the board, you've prepared materials for the board,
right.
et cetera, et cetera. So let's be clear, before you even left the Air Force, you were already doing board stuff, right? So you were running a 10 billion service where you were the chair of the board. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a very unique opportunity. I was chairman of the board of the Army Air Force Exchange Service, which is a 3,500 small box to big box store chain for members of the military, and it's a global business. I was chairman of the board. I had a wonderful CEO, a gentleman named Keith Thurgood, who was an Army reservist, had come out of Pepsi, and he was our CEO. But that really, back in 2008, really lit my fire to understand both certainly the military application of my skill set, as well as senior officer and position qualities that I had been able to put in my holster, if you will. But getting a sense of really the business side of the Department of Defense, but also that was a very unique position that I was able to be chairman of. I was also chairman of the Commissary Service, which is a non-profit or not-for-profit 250 food stores, whereas AFES, Army Air Force Exchange Service, was a for-profit $10 billion annual business. Okay. But besides those duties, which were very unique, by the way, in the opportunity that I had to be chairman, besides those duties, but every day running either being command of a major military installation, say up at Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, where we had hundreds of millions of dollars of assets, but also, millions and millions of dollars of a budget, that as a colonel. But then as I elevated into the ranks of senior officers, I then became responsible for overseeing the budget, overseeing decisions made about the budget in terms of where to, you have to make some very tough calls sometimes, say between $1 billion worth of weapon systems versus logistics or supply chain or people aspects of the budget as well. And I was key part of the air staff and what we call the Air Force Council, which is where all the senior leaders of the United States Air Force make decisions, and there's only, say, 10 or 15 in the room making these board-level decisions about the future of the United States Air Force. And you translate that into now in corporate America that I've experienced, where you're really making decisions about the future of a corporation. But all the time, certainly representing the shareholder. In our case, in the military, we remain, and especially in the Pentagon, we were ever so mindful of making sure that our men and women who are in active duty, the Guard or Reserve, in the military, in our case, the Air Force, had the tools, the equipment, the leadership, and the training to be able to go out and do their job. We never took our eye off the ball. And so if you translate that from a senior officer then going into a corporate or a private sector board structure, you always very much keep in mind the future of the corporation, your fiduciary responsibilities, but also to the shareholder who, you're responsible for, their, obviously their investment and so forth. So that to me, in a nutshell, is part of the translation, if that makes sense.
It does. And so let me put aside for a second the fact that you actually had board experience in the military, right? Because I don't think that is probably the norm of your peers coming out, right? That is a
Correct.
special background experience, which clearly helped. But let's generalize for a second, right? So when I think back to, say, my MBA experience at Wharton, the most incredible leader people in our classes had all come out of the military, right? They might have been honed at at West Point or Annapolis and different places like that, but certainly during their service, you think about integrity, leadership, passion, and to me, that's the fabric of our military leaders. And
Right.
let's just pretend you didn't have that board experience that you did for a second. As you began to pursue board stuff, I would assume part of the calling card is helping organizations realize, look at the value this is going to bring to the boardroom discussions, to your organization. Help our listeners to understand really how that translates across and why we need even more of that. We've seen all these headlines that seem so terrible about boards perhaps not making the right decisions or being on top of things.
Right. I think there's three areas I would think about in that realm. Although we could have this discussion for hours, but let me try to nail it down here. One is certainly you bring competencies, experiences, real world experiences in making tough decisions. Tough decisions about could be multi-billion-dollar weapon system down to human decisions as well. And that is running very large organizations, but also under the stress of either global events or maybe could be budgetary events or so forth, and making those decisions. But you come out of the military, particularly out of the senior ranks, with those competencies and experiences, and frankly, a very good network of both people inside the national security structure, but outside as well. And so that translates very effectively to me in the boardroom, are those competencies. And you can't find those in many places, if not very few. Secondly is, you alluded to this, but everyone that I work with at the senior ranks, and frankly all of my adult life, really there are core factors in your life that compels trust, it compels excellence, it compels integrity, and those things that you walk, you leave the military with, it never leaves you. And it starts from the day, actually, as an Air Force kid, but all the way through the Air Force Academy, or through others who've gone to West Point, or maybe through ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps courses. But you're gifted with this core belief structure of integrity and service before self and excellence, and it compels trust. The third, which I'm very interested in also, but is a sense of not only being able to deliver on, but an obligation, and that is leadership development. How are you going to develop those who are going to follow you? And that speaks also in the boardroom as well, in terms of developing leaders, developing effective board members, developing the C-suite management and leadership team that you're overseeing, if you will, as a board member. You're also highly capable, in my view, of having been honed the skill of being developed yourself as a leader, but then at the senior officer ranks, especially at the 3- and 4-star level, you are responsible for developing the leaders who will follow you and lead your institution. So those three areas, to me, again, we could talk about this for hours and hours, but that is very important to me and translates well, in my view, of those who would be candidates into the boardroom.
So, Dick, I would agree with all of that, and I feel like there might be sort of almost this unspoken other theme wrapping around all of those that I'm going to call sort of, whether it's giving back or paying it forward. I imagine it's part of the ethos of our senior military leaders of like, I have a responsibility to bring my skill set to others. You were talking about sort of developing leadership, the bench, which is a huge thing for every organization, but just sort of in general giving back of, I don't imagine most of our 3- and 4-stars when they retire just going to sit on the beach. They're not just sort of hanging out anymore. They're used to doing stuff and being effective and helping other people in whatever facet that might be. So I imagine there's sort of this internal drive, and this might be a good translation point of, okay, so now you were driven. I think you sort of talked about, you sort of scratched an itch earlier of like, ooh, this board stuff is really interesting. I might want to do more of this. So since we had those experiences that you successfully did in the military where you really had true board experience, and you have all of this stuff we just talked about that the senior military leaders bring when they leave, and you have this idea now of what am I going to do now I'm retired? Now, hopefully you got a little time with your wife and she forced you to sort of sit down and relax and spend some quality time together. And whenever that period ended and she said you were released, I would love you to go back and find some time for yourself to go do some things again. How did the board search go about?
Well, it's a great question. Let me back up just a little bit. When we say retired 3- and 4-stars, I would really include the cohort of some very senior retired colonels, but all the way in the 1 and 2 and 3 and 4-star ranks. I think that's a very, very exceptional cohort of people for for corporations, both in certainly in nonprofit, but also in for-profit, to consider as they look to either replenish or to expand their boardroom. But I was given the opportunity early on for my first for-profit board opportunity through a friend and a colleague who I got to know, a gentleman named Paul McNamara, who was a trustee, independent trustee of USA Mutual Funds. And he had asked, USA was looking to expand their the trustee, independent trustees, by one. And so I was asked to come interview and did so. And it was a matter of lots of due diligence on my part, but lots of due diligence certainly on the independent trustees. And I've been with USA Mutual Funds, now part of Victory Capital Management, as an independent trustee or independent director of nearly $75 billion or so worth of mutual funds. We have, I believe, 40, 45 funds ourselves. But my point is that that really is what started my board work. But it was a matter of less me going out and soliciting opportunities as they kind of found me, if you will. And so whenever, and I'm as I've mentioned to you offline, I'm on a number of boards. I try to keep the number between 3 and 4, so I don't try to. A number is not a large number, and I try to keep it relatively small because of that white space. You've got to put a lot of time and energy into your board duties, and it takes a lot of due diligence on your part through, in between board meetings and so forth. You've got lots of homework, and you really got to keep your eye on the ball in order to not only execute your obviously your fiduciary responsibilities, but again, keeping in mind of what's the best for the company, but also what's the best for the shareholder. That can be very time consuming. I've turned my white space control, not totally, but to Jody again. She helps me really manage my white space and make sure that my life is balanced both from a professional and a personal standpoint, and that includes, a number of board opportunities and time commitments and so forth. The last thing I want to do is become overcommitted for her and the family, but I don't want to become overcommitted also for my fellow board members, the C-suite management, and definitely don't want to be overcommitted for the shareholders because that's my responsibility. And so it is a time management thing, but it's also the blessing in all that is it really allows me to do something a lot different than a lot of my my colleagues and friends, lifelong friends who've been maybe went off into the defense sector or went into academia. And so there's you're constantly learning, you're constantly studying, you're constantly, but you're also leading and providing, hopefully some very very informed and experienced not only views but decisions that again promote stability for the company, but also again is looking out best to the interests of the shareholder.
So Dick, you made a really interesting point here that I want to draw out for everybody, because you've talked about this a couple times on the episode so far about where a typical military person might go, and we'll keep it at the board level. So we might think aerospace or defense, companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, places like that probably come to mind where they absolutely see the value of the military. They're probably trying to grab them as they come out. Just as you are, I'm a lifelong USA member, total loyalty to them, absolutely biased. Again, another organization, Fortune 500 company that loves the military. Like they pretty much have a rule in their board that they've got a 4-star from every one of the services on there. But the board is packed with people who really understand the military. And I know that will continue to diversify over time. So it sounds like, and this is where a really good translatable advice to our audience is, you were, whether it was intentional or not, you were finding opportunities that were a fit with places that recognized the value you bring, and to some extent pushing on an open door. But of course, we'll talk about the networking part to it as well. And I would say for many people listening to our audience, of course, you're trying to find who are the places that are the organizations, the industries that are going to value you and appreciate the skill set and the experience that you bring, because that's the good value of putting your time into place. So Dick, I'd love for you to sort of look back as you were exiting the military, and if you were giving advice to yourself back then, you might perhaps do things a little bit differently than the way you went about it from what you've learned about how the board space works and the networking and trying to find the opportunities. What advice, looking back, would you give to your younger self?
Well, I think number one is I would be ready to understand the vast fulfillment obligation you have once you become part of a board. There's a relationship inside the boardroom itself. There is understanding not only the context of the company or the corporation, but understand the obligation you have to the shareholder. Understand the fact that this is it's not just a one and done situation where, okay, I've now joined the board, therefore, actually that's when the work really, really begins. And you've got to stay current with everything that's going on, either in Washington, D.C. or within the, again, with the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, all those things, or other things that are happening inside the Federal Reserve and so forth. You really need to stay on top of what's happening, certainly nationally, but globally, but also what's happening inside the company as well. It takes a lot of work, and it will take a lot of work. The other aspect of this, though, is that when I first came on in the mutual fund trust of USAA, and subsequent boards I've joined, could be American Made Filtration Corporation, it could be Predasar Corporation, and so forth, all for-profit, and those are both ones I just mentioned. All of them actually are privately held, except Victory Capital now that we've gone to Victory Capital from USA. That's a publicly held company. I've always been very interested in why the board sought me out. What is the value proposition from your standpoint, board members? Why do you want Dick Newton in your boardroom? And why me? And just as important is how did you find me? Because I want to understand the relationship that we are now potentially going to have for the next several years, potentially. Why is it that you need me, and then help me understand what your process is for selection. And now that I've gone through a couple iterations, either within the USA funds at Victory Capital Management or with Predasar Corporation, or actually with American Made Filtration Corporation or a couple other boards that I'm aligned with, that's as compelling to understand in terms of who you recruit or try to retain on the board. But I also want to understand why the individual wants to come join our board. And we hope that it's just beyond just the fact that, compensation's there, got it. But what lights their fire? And what do they have the same, not only skill set and competencies, but also core values that I share, that I now share, by the way, with my fellow board members? Is that fair? Does that make sense?
It does. And, I would love to, you joked about this. We could talk about this for hours, right? I feel like this episode should never, there's so much I want to dig into with you, but I know at some point we're going to have to end this, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about some of the hot space that you're in now, because I know you're in SPACs, and we've actually yet to talk about this on this podcast, if that was possible, right? So I would love to spend the remaining time we have. What does it actually look like being involved in the SPACs? It's changing so fast. What does it feel like? Right. What does it look like? How did it start and come about for you?
Well, there was a gentleman named Alex Crutchfield who he leads a SPAC called ONS Acquisition. That's it. It's 3 letters, ONS, and it's acquisition. And we are a special purpose acquisition corporation, and our company, and we seek to take public opportunities, companies to take them public, mainly in the green space, environmental space. But Alex recruited me not to serve as a board of a director, but to serve on his board of advisors. And so he's assembled quite a team. And we just filed our S1 several weeks or so ago, and with the SEC, and that's very exciting. And we're now in another stage of the next stage of seeking investors to go after targeted companies within, as I mentioned, the green energy space. That's very exciting. He brought me on board because of the opportunities I've had with the mutual fund trust, with USA Family of Funds, as well as my work with Predasar Corporation and a couple others. And frankly, he reached back into my senior military skills or competencies based on my senior officer rank, I understand, but also, as I mentioned, chairman of the board of the Army Air Force Exchange Service, but also having sat on boards that ran the day-to-day or overseeing the operations of a U.S. military service. That thrown in there, but also looking to round off his board of advisors. I'm very unique in that regard But it's SPACs are they're hot commodities right now. I understand, but so that's on that side. We're looking at our company, the parent company of Tarrant Overall, to be, as we grow the company, do we become, part of a SPAC that would be termed a D-SPAC. So on the other side, as my role as vice chairman of Predastar Corporation, and soon to be hopefully vice chairman of Tarrant Overall, that we now are on the other side of the ledger. So it's a effective, appropriate, and ethical way to take a company public through obviously a lot of SEC oversight. But it's a new world though, and I'm learning as I go there. But that was a real blessing to be recruited by Alex to join his board of advisors, and then we'll see what we do in maybe ensuing SPACs in the next year or two.
Well, I'm going to circle this back as we begin to wrap up here, because one of the things that you talked about early on was I would translate it as sort of the growth and development for you personally in some of the board stuff that you're on, which has been exciting, which has been rewarding. And I know from our chats before, the SPACs really fit that bucket. There's so much to learn about the rules and the process and the opportunities. But I know that's given you great energy and excitement around it as well. And it sounds like your board journey, just continues to go onward and upward. And it is wonderful to hear the success that you've had. No surprise, of course, being, say, number 3 in the Air Force would certainly translate across to doing very well in the corporate space. And it's great to hear that, Dick. And I am so glad that perhaps we can be a little bit more inspiration, not to some of our military service members about what life like afterwards could feel like, because it's a whole new language, it's a whole new experience. Maybe it feels daunting, but also a reminder to everyone in the business world listening, like there are amazing people from our military that might be really good fits in your organizations. And Dick, as we think about this as a special Memorial Day episode, I'm going to leave the last minute or minute or two for you to think about what would we be sharing, whether it's with our military members or with the people listening in the business world.
Well, first, thank you for the opportunity, and I've really enjoyed this podcast, but I'm looking forward to, frankly, many more years with you, Alexander, as our relationship grows. But I would, for perspective, military members translating or transitioning, I think there are great opportunities for in terms of those being. I'm more of I don't want to sit on a number of boards. I want quality board experience. For the next 10 or 15 years, should I be blessed with those opportunities to serve. So I'm rather choosy, but there are a number of opportunities out there. Secondly, however, the network to get into boards and to be part of board structure in the private and commercial sector is not very effective, frankly, among senior military members. And I would like, I would like to lend support if there are transitioning senior military members out there who would like an opportunity to speak with me, or maybe me an opportunity to speak with them, I'd be delighted to do that. And we can do that offline in terms of contacts and so forth. But I think it's important that we grow our networks and our responsibility to bring a smooth transition and effectively bring really high-quality people from the senior ranks of the military into the boardroom. And there's no one way. That's not a cookie-cutter approach, but it does start with networking conversations with those and just, frankly, helping develop them into the private sector or the commercial sector. The last point regarding Memorial Day, at the end of the day, though, let's not forget we have 2 million men and women in uniform today, active duty, guard, and reserve, who are in hundreds of deployed locations or at home serving, in their installations. They're all volunteers, Alexander. They all have an oath and an obligation to this nation. And let's remember them on Memorial Day, but also, more importantly, those who have given their ultimate sacrifice, who were killed while on duty, and that their loved ones are now bearing the brunt of their ultimate sacrifice and are having to live without their loved ones by their side. And I think that's important. That is a solemn oath that the American people in this nation owes so few who've given so much. And so that's what I would leave you with on this day, as we march towards Memorial Day.
Well, Dick, thank you for those poignant words. And of course, we were delighted to have you on the show today. And thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
my pleasure. And again, I look forward to many more discussions with you. And I would tell the last point is, for those who are transitioning from military service, again, especially at the senior ranks, come on in. The water's great. This is a great opportunity.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Dick Newton. Dick is a dear friend of mine, and it was such an honor to have him on the show to help us all understand the sacrifices that not only the people in the service have made, but their families, but how that skill set also translates across into their second half of the career as they move into the private sector when they're working with organizations today. And we can see in Dick's life that incredible background and experience, the leadership, the passion, the ability to handle under pressure, decision-making, how that has worked for him today and how he's using that in the boardroom space. So great lessons for all of us as we think about how we try to land into the boardroom. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you'll miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.